Throughout history, art has often been associated with intention, education, and recognition. We tend to think of artists as people who consciously choose to create, who understand their audience and their place in the art world. But not all art begins that way. Some of the most unsettling and emotionally intense images ever created were not made for galleries, critics, or viewers at all. They were created in isolation, often in silence, by individuals whose inner reality was already far removed from the outside world. This kind of art doesn't ask to be understood. It simply exists, as a trace of something deeply personal. And this is where the story of Asylum Art begins. But what exactly is Asylum Art? Asylum art refers to artworks created by patients inside psychiatric institutions, primarily in the late 19th and early 20th century. These were people who were often confined for long periods of time, sometimes permanently, and largely cut off from society. Art in this context was not created with artistic ambition. It wasn't meant to impress, to communicate with an audience, or to participate in cultural discourse. For many patients, drawing or painting became a way to externalize overwhelming thoughts, to impose order on inner chaos, or simply to cope with daily life inside the asylum. Most of these works were produced without formal training. There were no artistic rules to follow, no movements to align with, no expectations to meet. The images emerged directly from personal necessity rather than conscious design. At the time, these works were not considered art in any meaningful sense. They were treated as medical material, visual documents used by psychiatrists to study mental states, symptoms, and disorders. Their emotional or aesthetic power was largely ignored. Over time, however, some observers began to notice something unsettling. These images were not random. They were often repetitive, symbolically charged, and internally consistent. Certain forms, patterns, and figures appeared again and again, as if the artists were responding to an inner logic rather than external instruction. This raised an uncomfortable question. What if these works were not merely symptoms of illness, but expressions of an inner reality? This shift in thinking became especially influential through the development of art brut, later also known as outsider art. The term was popularized by artist Jean Dubuffet, who was drawn to creative works produced outside the traditional art world by people without formal training, often living on the margins of society. Dubuffet believed that these works possessed a rawness and authenticity that conventional art had lost. Asylum art played a central role in shaping this idea. One of the most important foundations for this perspective was the Prinzhorn collection. In the 1920s, German psychiatrist Hans Prinzhorn assembled a vast archive of drawings, paintings, and sculptures created by psychiatric patients from institutions across Europe. In 1922, Prinzhorn published the book Artistry of the Mentally Ill, which marked a major turning point. Rather than treating these works purely as clinical evidence, Prinzhorn analyzed them as genuine creative expressions. He focused on form, symbolism, repetition, and emotional intensity, approaching the works not just as a doctor, but as a careful observer of human creativity. The book and the collection had a profound influence on modern artists, particularly surrealists and expressionists, who recognized in these images something deeply human and unsettling. What had once been dismissed as pathological began to be seen as meaningful, not because of illness, but because of expression. Let's go back to the asylum art again. To truly understand what asylum art represents, it helps to look at individual examples. Of course, not to diagnose the artists, and not to reduce their work to illness, but to see how different inner worlds found radically different visual forms. Among the many figures associated with asylum art, one name stands out in particular: August Natterer. August Natterer was a German electrician who spent most of his adult life in psychiatric institutions. He was committed to a psychiatric hospital in 1907 due to anxiety and delusions, and remained there against his will until his death. Unlike many other patients, his work is remarkable for its clarity, structure, and obsessive precision. His drawings are often densely packed with symbols, geometric arrangements, religious imagery, and elaborate systems. Everything appears carefully ordered, almost architectural, as if the images were attempts to map an inner universe that followed its own strict logic. Natterer himself described experiencing vivid visions, complex, overwhelming images that felt more real than the external world. His drawings can be understood as attempts to stabilize these visions, to translate something intangible into a fixed visual form. What makes his work especially striking is the absence of chaos. Despite the intensity of his inner experiences, his images feel controlled, deliberate, and methodical. This challenges the common assumption that art created in psychiatric institutions must be disordered or incoherent. In Natara's work, we don't see confusion. We see a different system of meaning, one that operates independently from shared reality. To better understand this, let's take a look at two of August Natara's most well-known works to illustrate how his inner experiences translated into visual form. First, we have the painting, My Eyes in the Time of Apparition. This drawing shows nothing but a pair of eyes, isolated on the page. At first glance, the image appears simple, almost clinical. But the title immediately reframes what we are seeing. Natara described experiencing intense visual apparitions, moments in which perception itself felt altered. In this work, the eyes are not symbols of observation, but of being overwhelmed by vision. They suggest a state in which the act of seeing becomes intrusive, uncontrollable, and deeply personal. The symmetry of the eyes contrasts with their emotional weight. They stare outward, but also seem detached from a body, as if perception has separated from the self. Rather than expressing fear directly, the image conveys a quiet intensity, a fixation on vision as both a gateway and a burden. The drawing does not ask us to understand what was seen. It asks us to consider what it means when seeing itself becomes an experience that cannot be turned off. The second painting is called Witch's Head. In Witch's Head, Natara presents a large, structured human profile filled with intricate internal landscapes. Houses, paths, and architectural elements appear embedded within the head itself, transforming the human mind into a physical environment. The figure feels less like a person and more like a container, a space in which thoughts, memories, and symbols coexist simultaneously. The exaggerated scale of the head suggests dominance. The inner world outweighs the external one. Despite the fantastical title, the image is not chaotic. Everything appears carefully placed, almost mapped. This reinforces a recurring theme in Natara's work. Inner experiences may be overwhelming, but they are not random. They follow their own internal order. Rather than depicting madness, the drawing visualizes a mind that has become its own world, self-contained, immersive, and impossible to fully access from the outside. Together, these works show that Natara was not attempting to shock or provoke. He was attempting to record. His drawings function less as artistic statements and more as visual translations of experiences that had no other outlet. While Natara is one of the most well-documented figures, he was far from alone. There are hundreds of different artists who painted Asylum Art. Artists like Adolf Wölfli created vast visual and narrative worlds, combining drawing, music, and text into endless autobiographical universes. His work feels compulsive, overwhelming, and deeply immersive. Others, such as Emma Hawke, produced repetitive, almost abstract letter drawings, pages filled with dense writing that blur the line between language and image, expression and obsession. And these are just two of many other examples, but going through all of them would be too much. These artists differed greatly in style, but they shared something essential. Their work was not created to be understood by others. It was created because it had to exist. These works were not created to communicate ideas, impress an audience, or participate in art history. They exist because the act of creation became necessary, a way to externalize inner experiences that could not be spoken, organized, or shared in any other form. What makes Asylum Art so powerful is its sincerity. There is no performance here, no self-awareness, no attempt to shape how the work will be received. The images do not ask for interpretation, they simply present fragments of inner reality as they were experienced, and perhaps that is why these works still resonate today. They challenge our assumptions about creativity, intention, and normality. They remind us that art does not always come from clarity or control, but sometimes from the need to survive overwhelming inner states. Asylum Art sits at the edge of what we consider art, psychology, and documentation. It exists in a space where expression becomes necessity, and where creation is not a choice, but a response. In that sense, these works are not distant historical curiosities. They are records of human experience at its most exposed. But what is your opinion on Asylum Art? Write your opinion in the comments down below. And if you want to see more art analyses, check out my latest video right here, where we are going to analyze one of the most tragic paintings ever made. Thank you for watching, and I will see you there.